Hey rePROs, if you like this show, you might like Public Health is Dead. Hosted by Danielle Bezalel, a public health advocate with a background in epidemiology and health science, it's a new podcast that brings undaunted public health defenders together to plot a new path forward for better health for us all. If you have been watching, like I have, the Trump administration attacking public health institutions worldwide, you know that all is not well in the world of public health. It's failing right now. Preventable diseases are, well, preventable, and you deserve to know. This show is your anti-establishment field guide to surviving in the age of pandemics. Listen and subscribe to Public Health is Dead on Apple Podcasts, your favorite podcast app, or publichealthisdead.com. Hey rePROs, we're excited to bring you a special feed drop today from Rom Com Vom, a miniseries from Sex Ed with DB that dives into the messy, problematic, and sometimes surprisingly insightful themes in our favorite romantic comedies. This clip comes from their episode on Juno, where host Danielle Bezalel, an adoption and abortion researcher and sociologist Dr. Gretchen Sisson, unpack the film's portrayal of adoption, teen pregnancy, and reproductive rights. They discuss what Juno gets right, what it glosses over, and how its cultural impact still resonates today. If you enjoy this conversation, you can check out the full episode plus more deep dives into rom-com tropes by searching for Rom Com Vom or Sex Ed with DB wherever you listen to your podcasts. And now let's get into this great conversation between DB and Dr. Gretchen Sisson.
Today, we are so lucky to have Dr. Gretchen Sisson with us. She's a sociologist studying abortion and adoption at UCSF and the author of Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. Her work has been cited in the Supreme Court dissent for Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, and she's written extensively about the realities of adoption in the U.S. We couldn't think of a better guest to help us dive into today's film, which you'll learn about in a second. One of the most popular and influential portrayals of adoption in pop culture thus far. Gretchen, we're so excited to have you on Rom Com Vom. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thrilled that you're here. Can't wait to get into it with an expert. And here's the trivia teaser from last week. This 2007 indie darling was written in just 6 weeks at Minnesota coffee shops, and it launched the career of an Oscar-nominated screenwriter and forever changed how we think about orange Tic Tacs. Drum roll. Today we're reviewing Juno. Gretchen, how do you feel? Are you excited that we're reviewing this movie today?
I'm actually really excited to talk about this movie. I have been thinking and overthinking this film since it came out. So I'm really excited to get into it.
Ooh, I love the phrase thinking and overthinking. So I'm sure we're going to hear all of the details about that. But before we dive into Juno, can you just tell us a little bit about your work? What got you interested in studying adoption? What inspired you to write your book, Relinquished? I'm just curious to hear all of it.
Yeah. So I started studying adoption when I was working at an organization in Boston called the Alliance on Teen Pregnancy. So most of our work at the Alliance was really about supporting pregnant and parenting young people, not unlike Juno, and figuring out how to help them in their advocacy for what they needed to successfully raise their families and move towards self-sufficiency. And this was soon after, just a few years after Juno had come out, but it was also right around the time that 16 and Pregnant came out on MTV.
Oh, wow. I used to love that show.
Yeah. And a lot of the young mothers that I worked with, we watched the show pretty religiously to see the stories that were being told about their lives as young mothers. And on that first season, Caitlin and Tyler were a couple who became pregnant in high school and relinquished their daughter for adoption. And the narrative around Caitlin and Tyler's story was very much that they were more mature, they were better parents for having given up their daughter, that this sacrifice actually made them that more worthy in a way than their counterparts who were working really hard to raise their kids. I wasn't seeing that any of these understandings of adoption were actually reflective of what people's experiences with adoption were, what they look like. And so I wanted to examine that more deeply and started doing my own research on the experiences of mothers who have relinquished infants for private adoption. That was in 2010. I continued that data collection, and then I went back and re-interviewed a lot of the same mothers in 2020.
Wow.
So that's really the core of the book. So.
Wow. I'm so excited to get more into this. We're going to move on to the main kind of segment of this show, which is called That's Problematic, where we go over a few themes in general and kind of discuss and decipher like what kind of is problematic about this and maybe how could it have been better. And so I think like the first major theme that we'll talk about is just how adoption is framed in general in Juno. I think like a few things like adoption is kind of presented as like quote unquote an easy choice for her, which is, as you very well know, like in stark contrast to the way that real life birth mothers and parents experience adoption. Another piece of this is like Vanessa and Mark as the perfect couple, like, which later we learn like they're not so perfect. They're not very happy together, actually. And I wonder like what it actually looks like in real life for couples and their reality who are, adopting a baby. And then kind of what you mentioned before, which is like teen parents can't really succeed or shouldn't even try at that. So what thread do you want to pull? What?
Well, let's start with Mark and Vanessa, I think, because I think that's actually where the film is most right about adoption. So the things that it gets right are that adoption is almost always the transfer of babies from poorer families and parents to more affluent families. And I think that you see that the class difference between Mark and Vanessa in their suburban, very beautifully decorated home, as opposed to Juno's very working class family and her home, and kind of the ways that she is immediately out of place, not out of place in that she's kind of excluded from, but just that it's very much a fish out of water scenario when she's there. You can see how different she is from them. And you can see even when her father comes to Mark and Vanessa's home to meet with the lawyer the first time. And he's like, what is that? And Vanessa's like, that's a Pilates machine. He goes, oh, what do you make with that? Yes. Right. Like these are kind of all these signifiers of the class difference, the socioeconomic difference between where Juno is coming from and where Mark and Vanessa are. And I think that is really, that is correct. That is something that happens in adoption all the time. And the extent to which a lot of the mothers I spoke with kind of got starstruck by their child's adoptive parents, especially during the pre-birth matching phase, because of their privilege, because whatever was bringing them to the adoption, right? Lack of money and other resources, lack of support, usually for girls who were young like Juno, the fact that their own parents weren't supportive of them parenting to a far harsher degree than Juno goes through. They turn to the adoptive parents. And for a lot of them, that was the aspiration, right? This sort of married, middle class, affluent stability. That was what they wanted, not just for their child, but for themselves. And so a lot of that, when Juno kind of talks about like, oh, I kind of want this like graphic designer with a cool Asian girlfriend who like plays the bass guitar, but I don't want to be too picky, right? Like you have, the way that a lot of the mothers that I interviewed talked about their child's adoptive parents, like, oh, the mom is a fashion designer and the dad is a news broadcaster. And just this idea of them as kind of larger than life, better than life, picture perfect. That is true. And I think that the film actually captured that in a really interesting way. And the way that Mark kind of becomes the person that Juno connects with the most I think that the way that Mark and Juno's relationship develops is not typical, but kind of her like girlish infatuation with him and looking for points of connection with him, I think is real in some ways. And of course he makes it weird, right? I don't want to act like that is the norm, but I think that like her working to find an adult that she can connect with in a substantive way is real. And seeing that in her child's prospective adoptive father is not unusual. Or with Vanessa, right? I think that her relationship with Vanessa is really different than her relationship with Mark, but she definitely sees her something aspirational in how beautiful she is, right? How professional, how polished she is.
Her perfume.
And her preparedness. Like, yeah, exactly.
Her bathroom.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's real. So I think that the film gets that dynamic right in a lot of ways. And I also think that it captures a lot of small moments around Vanessa, and they don't even comment on Vanessa and Mark's inability to conceive beyond the fact that they wanted to have a child for many years. But there are a few moments where, Juno makes a joke about how being pregnant sucks. And Vanessa says, I think being pregnant is beautiful. And Juno says, well, you're lucky you don't have to go through it. And Vanessa kind of has
it's not you.
This moment where you can tell that's been, that strikes her, right? Because she's obviously someone who very, very desperately wants to be pregnant. And I think that is, you can see that that's real. And the tension that their inability to conceive has created in their marriage over time is real. Their disagreement over when and whether to paint the baby's room, how much stuff to buy, what they can expect of their friends, the fact that they don't think their friends are going to throw them a baby shower because they've kind of had a failed adoption before that they just kind of mention in passing. I think all of that stress on a relationship and on people is real. And I think that the film does a good job of capturing that. So those are the things I think it gets right around this. I think it gets everything about Juno's pregnancy decision wrong. Nothing about how Juno thinks about her pregnancy, thinks about the options that are available to her throughout her pregnancy, reflect really any of the mothers that I interviewed in my research.
Tell me more.
In any fundamental way. So most mothers that relinquish infants for adoption don't try to have an abortion. Most mothers who relinquish infants continue their pregnancies because they want to parent. And what we found is that this is true for women who have abortions and women who relinquish for adoptions. They're always choosing between parenting and something else. So this is true even of women who are denied access to abortion. When you deny people access to abortion, 91% of those women who give birth as a result of abortion denial are going to be parenting. So even when you take away the option of abortion, most women are parenting. And when you look at the mothers who relinquish, very few of them tried to have an abortion. And if they hadn't relinquished, they would be parenting their children. And so almost none of the women that I interviewed were choosing between adoption and abortion at one point in their pregnancy. So if abortion is off the table because they can't access one, they can't afford one, it's illegal, they're past the gestational limit at which they can pursue one, all of that, they'll turn to adoption in different ways. But adoption kind of is the last case scenario. It's what happens when nothing else feels possible, because you can't afford to parent, you don't have support around parenting, or you can't access abortion. And so I think that the way that Juno moves very quickly and doesn't think deeply about whether or not she wants to have an abortion, but is clearly uncomfortable at the clinic that she goes to, that is not what we know about women who go to get abortions either, right? People who go to get abortions have been planning on getting an abortion since they got their positive pregnancy test. They're very sure of their decision. They have very low levels of regret after their abortion decision and for years thereafter.